What's going on, Goombas? My name is Michael Jaymes, and I'm a published author and self-employed writing coach. And as a writing coach, one of the services I offer is alpha reading. And if you don't know what alpha reading is, it's basically where I give professional feedback and suggestions on people's early drafts and outlines of their manuscripts or books. If you're interested in this service, feel free to reach out. Social links below. But through alpha reading, I have read hundreds of different chapters and manuscripts from different authors, and one of the biggest mistakes I find is stilted dialogue. So today, we're going to be covering 13 of the most common mistakes I see, and hopefully covering these will help you not only improve your dialogue, but it will ultimately help you avoid making these mistakes yourself. Now, before we go over these 13 common mistakes, I do want to just emphasize that none of these are necessarily wrong or bad in and of themselves. Some of these things can be used if they're used correctly or well, but oftentimes when they're used, especially by newer writers, they are used incorrectly or used in a way that doesn't really benefit their story. So I want to emphasize that because there will be times where some of these things can be used and they can be used well to cause a certain effect in your story, but most of the times, these are things that you want to avoid. All right, so mistake number one that you want to avoid is overusing one-way dialogue. If a character is talking to themselves.
You talking to me?
Or if they're talking to, maybe they are talking to someone else, but there's no dialogue coming back at them. They're talking to someone and there's no one responding. Maybe they're talking to an animal or some type of object, or maybe they're just thinking and you're recording their thoughts like dialogue. All of this is one-way dialogue, and it is pretty common in writing, but it is overused by newer writers very often, and it can leave a very bad taste in a lot of readers' mouths because it's dry and it can be boring. And the reason it's dry and boring is because there's no conflict. When you have dialogue, one of the most interesting parts of dialogue is that you're hearing different takes on whatever the topic is or the subject at hand is. Especially if you have conflict in your dialogue, that's what makes it very interesting to the reader and intriguing to read. Or if you have emotional rises or falls through the dialogue, if it's something like a romantic scene. So when it comes to something like one-way dialogue, there's not much emotional tension or physical movement going on in the scene, causing the scene to kind of drag or slow down. Another thing that one-way dialogue can cause, especially if this is the main character either talking to themselves or talking to like an animal or an object, is you are forcing your reader to think a certain way. And if you think about how storytelling works, and this happens especially in first-person point of view type stories, but if you think about how storytelling works, the main character is who you are immersing your reader into the life of. Your reader, your audience, is literally seeing themselves in their shoes. So if you have one-way dialogue and it's a lot, you're forcing your reader to think a certain way, which can be a little off-putting to some readers. They kind of want to figure things out on their own as they read the narrative and as they explore your world and your story. You're basically forcing them to think something instead of just figuring things out based on actions or events along the plot of the story. So make sure if you use one-way dialogue, you use it very minimally, or you just cut it out completely. Mistake number two that writers make in their dialogue is having too many plot points in their dialogue. The most common way this happens is when a writer has their character give some kind of exposition or backstory in the dialogue that reveals how everything makes sense of the story. So you oftentimes see this at the very beginning of a story. You have somebody that Christopher Vogler would call Harry the Explainer. And having someone just explain everything can make your reader feel kind of dumb because a lot of times they're explaining the events and what's already taken place, maybe the inciting incident, and they're explaining how they got to that point. And your reader can figure that out just by reading the story themselves. Now, sometimes you're explaining things like backstory and all this exposition that doesn't necessarily have to do with what the story has shown already, and that's to try to make the story make sense. But if that be the case, then perhaps you should just have a scene that includes that so you don't have to have a main character explaining it all out. And if that's not possible and you do need it explained through dialogue, then make sure that it's not just this giant info dump of this is how the world works or this is how this plot's going to unfold. Instead, you have it dripped throughout different conversations, or maybe you have one conversation but it's slowly brought out in a very interesting way instead of just this long paragraph that basically explains everything to the reader. Another mistake where plot points can sometimes come out in dialogue is when characters are trying to solve some kind of mystery or put together some clues in a story. Some writers make the mistake of having their characters gather around something like a dining room table, or they gather at the bar and they talk over the clues, and then they come to a conclusion and they solve a riddle or solve a problem just sitting around a table together.
Sit down and figure this out.
And that's not interesting. It's not interesting for them to solve an issue just through talking about it. It's more interesting if there's some kind of action involved, or maybe you can still have a scene where they're talking about it, but they don't solve it right there. They go out and about with their day and they figure it out in action while they're moving in the story. Again, this isn't to say that you can't have scenes where you have your team of characters come together and try to solve things and figure things out. And this isn't to say that they can't find a clue through dialogue sometimes, but you shouldn't have especially all of your clues like that. You want to have some kind of movement and events happening in your story so that your reader stays engaged and they're intrigued by the events and aren't just reading about people talking about solving their problems. Instead, they're seeing them solve them in real life. The last place you might see exposition come out in a story is at the very end, sometimes when a villain and a hero come together before a last duel or a last fight of some sort. A lot of times the villain will explain and unravel his entire plan and say, this is how everything worked and this is how I did it. And that is pretty cliche. Sometimes it can still work, if it's done well. Again, it's something that you don't want just this long monologue of them just going off on how they did it. Typically, your villain will have some kind of pride or cocky attitude. Sometimes you will see them kind of puff out their chest and talk about how smart they were if they outsmarted the good guy, or they think they've won in the end and they're unraveling their plan. But that doesn't mean that you should have this long monologue of them doing that. You should drip it through the conversation, through the dialogue, or through different actions so that it either unravels across a single scene or maybe multiple chapters or the book as a whole. You just want to make sure that you don't have this info dump of exposition or backstory in your dialogue anywhere. Mistake number 3 that many writers make is having all of their characters sound the same. So every character must have some type of unique voice and way that they speak. This means that they may have a certain accent or a certain dialect, which those are two different things. Accent focuses more on the way words are pronounced, where dialect might have to do more with the origin of where that person comes from. And they may have different occupations, which will make their comparisons and metaphors that they use in dialogue much different than a different character. One character might be talkative while another is quite short with the way they speak. You might have one ramble about things that aren't super focused while another one is very focused on the task at hand. You might have one that always brings morality into the conversation while another is very lackadaisical with how they speak. Age, status, all of these things will factor into how a character is, and that's important to how they're going to speak in their dialogue. So make sure that your characters don't sound the same. Mistake number 4 that writers make is having an inconsistent voice. So piggybacking off the last point, if you are going to have characters with unique voices, then you need to make sure they all are consistent with their voices. You don't want him to talk like he's a wise old man in this chapter and then talk like a child in the next chapter. You want to make sure that your character is consistent with the way they speak throughout the entire book. I do want to quickly just mention that when it comes to different characters' unique dialogue, you don't have to make them super unique. You don't have to say that they have a southern accent and they have a lisp and they speak 3 different languages and they can't pronounce S's, whatever it is. Like, you don't have to say all these different things that are going to make them speak super uniquely. It could just be one subtle thing. For example, you might have a character that chews gum and every time they're talking, they're always chewing their gum while they talk. That could be one unique trait that makes the way they speak more unique to that character. Or you might have a character that's always picking at his teeth with a toothpick while he talks. Or you might have a character that's always clearing his throat before he speaks, or whatever it is. Just try to think of ways that you can make characters unique with the way that they speak or the actions that have to do with the way they speak. Mistake number 5 is overusing unique dialogue tags. Now, there is a camp out there of writers that say you should only use the word said, and then there's another camp out there that says never use the word said is overused. It's going to depend on your writing style and the way you want to write. Personally, I'm in the middle. I do use said probably more frequently than any other dialogue tag. Well, no, I definitely do. but that doesn't mean I don't use other dialogue tags as well. One of the mistakes many new writers will make is they try to avoid said like it's a plague, and they'll use so many different dialogue tags that it's just exhausting to read the dialogue. If one line says that he says something, then it says he breathed, he gasped, he ranted, he commanded, he cried, he yelled, and you keep describing the different ways he's talking, it's just going to be confusing. It's not going to sound cohesive and clear. Like, it's just not going to work. Like, you can't do that. Typically, the emotion of a scene will get across to your reader how the dialogue should be said or should be heard by them. So you don't always have to use these unique dialogue tags. And even then, if you do want to use a unique dialogue tag of some sort, make sure you're using it at a specific or special occasion within the scene, and it's not just randomly thrown in there. So this isn't to say that you can't use said or you should use said or anything like that. Just be mindful of how often you are using unique dialogue tags. Which leads me into mistake number 6, which is not having action tags. Now, I notice this in a lot of the writers that I'm reading their work through, but a ton of different writers do not have any action tags, which are so beneficial to add movement into dialogue, to make a scene a little more vibrant, a little more visual, a little more interesting to the reader. If you don't know what action tags are basically when you have an action take place either before or after a sentence of dialogue, just kind of showing what the character that's speaking is doing either during that dialogue or after that dialogue. So if you say she crossed her arms and then you say her dialogue line, it's going to show a different type of emotion than if you said her lip quivered and then you have her speak her dialogue line, or she stomped her feet and then you say her dialogue line, whatever it may be. So adding an action tag can really help with putting some movement into your dialogue and just helping the flow a little bit and helping us build a visual of the scene that's going on. Mistake number 7 is having small talk in your story. And this is a pretty common mistake that writers make, and it's a pretty common tip that you've probably heard before. But basically, anytime you have characters greeting each other, asking how their day's going, or hey, Paul, oh, hey, Mark, how you doing today? Oh, I'm doing good. How are you? Oh, lovely weather we're having today. If you have any of that stuff, just take it out. It's usually not useful. It's not helping the plot move forward. It's not going to intrigue us and make us want to read more. I can't remember what writer said this, but I was listening to an interview the other day where a writer said that every single line that you write should cause us to want to read the next one, and the next one, and the next one. So when you read the line, hey, Paul, how's your day going? Does that make you want to read the next one? Not really. It just seems like any ordinary conversation. But if the conversation starts with, Paul, you'll never believe what happened today, that's a little more intriguing. I might want to read the next line and see what happened today. So try to just cut out all of the small talk.
You hate small talk.
And get right into the conversation and get us right into the movement of the scene and the emotions and the tension of that dialogue. Mistake number 8 is repeating character names. And obviously you have to introduce characters somehow and remind us of who is speaking at different times. So dialogue or dialogue tags are a great way to do this. But that being said, it can sound unnatural if people are using first names far too often. One way to fix this is to move some of the names to the tags or to have action tags that make it clear who is speaking. So, for example, if you had a group of 3 different people in the room and only one of them is a female, you can say she flicked her hair over her shoulder and then have her speak her line. And you're not using her name there, but you're also making it clear that she's the one speaking because she's the only she in the room. So that's just an example of how you can use an action tag to clarify who is speaking without having to overuse her name repeatedly. Another way to help with this is to consider using nicknames. Nicknames just flow a little bit better sometimes. That being said, they can be misused or overused just like character names, so just be careful with them. But if you want to slip in some nicknames there, that can help sometimes too. Mistake number 9 is including unnecessary words. So this is a tough rule to follow at times, but it's still important to consider because a lot of times we want our dialogue to sound natural, like the way we normally speak. We want it to sound conversational. But the problem with this mindset is that we are awful speakers. Like, none of us speak clear or great English at all. We all use words like and just and kinda and very and literally and actually and so many more, and they're all just basically filler words and filler sounds that come out of us when we can't think straight, or accordingly. And you'll probably hear in this video, sometimes I say, it's a filler that just comes out of us. You don't want your characters to be speaking like that. While they may make the conversation sound a little more natural, since we use this in our own speech, they'll stretch the dialogue more than necessary, and typically it's best to keep dialogue tight like the rest of your writing unless it fits a certain character. You might have a character that stutters a lot or is very nervous all the time, so maybe it's more fitting for them. But other than that, you really want to cut these words out for the most part. Mistake number 10 is not having purposeful words. Every paragraph, every sentence, every single word of text must be building up the story, whether that means adding character depth or adding setting details or adding to the plot as a whole. Everything must be progressing towards the end of the story. Oftentimes, writers have dialogue that does not do this. There's no progression, and it's just taking too long to get there. Stagnant dialogue can cause a scene to sag, feeling like it's lacking any purpose at all, and it makes your dialogue feel purposeless, useless. It's like, why am I reading this scene if it's meaningless to me? This can happen in the beginning, the middle, or the end of a dialogue scene. If it happens in the beginning, it's likely that your characters are not getting to the main point of that scene quickly enough.
Get to the point, will you?
If it's happening in the middle of the scene, it's likely that you lost your way through the dialogue and you're not focusing on the main point anymore, and you need to get back to it. You need to cut some things out and change some things so that it stays focused on the main point. And if it happens at the end of the scene, you may be rambling. You may want to cut some of those lines or change things around so that the conversation ends with some sort of direction. So make sure that your dialogue feels purposeful and that the beginning, middle, and end all have a set focus so that your reader is engaged throughout the entire dialogue scene. Mistake number 11, or I can't do that with my hands, but mistake number 11 that a lot of writers will make is telling the emotions too much. It's speaking their mind or speaking their emotions right on the page and making it too clear, too obvious. It may seem kind of funny, but I've literally read lines that say things like, "I'm so mad right now," or "You're scaring me." And sometimes we even speak like this, but lines of dialogue like this, while in some rare cases they may work, it's not common for characters to speak their emotions. Maybe unless they're a child. A child does speak their emotions pretty frequently. But if your main character is a grown man, he's not going to say, "I'm very angry with you right now." That's so unnatural. So ensure that your emotions are known by the words and actions, not explicitly stated within the dialogue. Mistake number 12 to avoid is answering directly every single time. And this is a really crucial one. I see this happen a lot. You don't want every character to sound like they are just confident with everything they state, and you don't want every character to be trustworthy in every single way. Different characters are going to answer different questions different ways, and that's how you can lead a lot of readers astray, by having different characters either be lying, deceptive, hiding things, unsure of things. All of that creates engagement and causes us to want to keep reading to find out what's going on in this scene and what they really mean by what they're saying. Basically, if every character always answers directly, you're making them feel omniscient in a way, and it feels like they always know what to say and when to say it. Consider having some characters not always answer directly. This may be because maybe they answer questions with questions all the time, or maybe they're hiding something, or maybe they simply don't know the answer. Mixing up the way characters answer others is a great way to build character without explaining everything that they are thinking or actually may know. And last but not least, mistake number 13 is just let the subtext speak for itself. This is something that I struggle with, that advanced writers struggle with. Every writer probably struggles with this. It is so difficult to know when the subtext is clear enough and when it's not. It's something that's just going to come with progressively writing more and more and reading more and more so you can understand how subtext works. But really, this is such a big one, and it kind of blankets every single tip I've already given and all the other mistakes I've already mentioned. The subtext is basically the invisible words on the page, or the thread that ties everything together. It's the words that aren't said but are known from context. Just to give you a quick example, let's say in your story you have a boyfriend and girlfriend, and the boyfriend never comes over when he says he was going to come over the night before, and now they're meeting each other at school, and he walks up to her and she slams the locker and she's about to walk away, and he's like, "Hey, what's wrong? Are you okay?" And she answers, "I'm fine."
Yeah, I'm fine, thank you, I'm fine, yeah.
And then she walks away. without saying any more there, you don't have to explain that scene. We know from the subtext she's not actually fine. We know from the subtext that she's actually super angry. She's wondering where he was last night. She's wondering why he didn't show up. But you don't have to explain all that. So that's just an example of what subtext is. It's the invisible context that's going on in the scene, depending on the narration and the story as a whole. Not allowing the subtext to speak for itself can sometimes lead to readers feeling like you're over-explaining or you're making them feel dumb because you're kind of telling them how the story works without letting them figure that out on their own or understand it on their own. It can make a book feel a little cheesy. It can dumb it down, making it feel like it's for a different age group. It can cause a lack of engagement. It can just cause a lot of issues if you are over-explaining things. Even within the story, this often leads to drier relationships because if you are not letting the subtext speak for itself, you're often explaining emotions, like I spoke about in one of the other mistakes, and that leads to relationships kind of feeling dry or not feeling authentic. So anytime someone is over-explaining their feelings, their thoughts, or their reasoning, or whatever it may be, consider withholding some of that information, allowing the narrative to speak for itself. So those are the 13 most common mistakes I see in writing dialogue. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you are still here and you liked this video, leave a like. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this video, and let me know if you have other types of videos you want me to make or different topics you want me to cover. Let me know. I'd love to cover them for you. Thanks so much for watching. If you are interested in alpha reading and having your first draft or your outline or something like that read and receiving some feedback on it, reach out. I'd love to help you out. And if you want to support me, you can buy some of my books. I'm a published author. I have 2 different books out. In this spring 2024, I'll have my 3rd book published, so you could check out that book when it comes out. It's called You've Got the Wrong Guy. It's awesome, and I can't wait to share it. Or if you don't want to buy one of my books, go to the link below and buy me a coffee. That's all I got for you guys. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.